The SCP Foundation is a fictional organization which specializes in containing, cataloging, and studying unknown abnormalities, hence the common motto, Secure, Contain, Protect. It stands for the Special Containment Procedure Foundation, and the anomalies held within this foundation are coined as SCPs. Many of the anomalies that are held within this foundation can apply to people, entities, items, or locations which are beyond the understanding of the average person. This foundation is crowded in secrecy, with the cataloging of these anomalies being top secret from the public. There are several classes used to catalog these entities, with the three most common classes being Safe, Euclid, and Keter. These classes aren't necessarily used to decide whether these SCPs are dangerous or not, but more so for their difficulty in containment. Safe is most often applied to the SCPs which are easiest to contain, and ones that are able to be left alone without serious worry of a containment breach. Euclid is a more general class, applied to the SCPs which aren't very well understood and may potentially cause a breach in containment if left alone for an extensive amount of time. And Keter is delegated to the SCPs which are most difficult to contain, with these SCPs oftentimes having the capability of causing massively destructive containment breaches if not kept under 24/7 supervision by a team of people. There are other classes outside of the main three, such as Thaumiel and Apollyon. However, I'll leave the explanation for these two a little bit later in the video for the special SCPs. Now, I've seen multiple of these SCP videos circulating YouTube. Top 22 scariest SCPs, the SCP Foundation explained, and I am no different. Now, I'm sure that if you guys click this video, that you know the most popular SCPs like the Statue, Shy Guy, the Plague Doctor, etc. But I wanted to cover the not so popular SCPs that I found extremely interesting. But enough stalling for this video. Without further ado, let's get started.
Series 1.
SCP-055, the Self-Keeping Secret. SCP-055 is inherently one of the most unknown entities in the facility. Its obtainment is unknown. How it was captured is unknown. The person who captured it is unknown. Everything about it is unknown. When checkups of this SCP are proceeding, the people who see and observe its actions quickly forget everything about it within mere minutes. Even the people who made this document entirely forgot about it. The only reason its existence is remotely made aware of by the Foundation is a result of the fact that these details are slowly picked up and remembered when people find its document. But just like everybody else is made aware of it, it becomes slowly forgotten shortly after it's discovered. Several hypotheses put out the plausible idea that this SCP is meant to quietly observe the Foundation and how it runs, with the purpose of remaining unknown so as to not be made aware of and neutralized. SCP-152, the book that predicts the end of humanity. This SCP is a possibly ancient book, which is inscribed with multiple apocalyptic events predicting the end of the human race. This book has entries dating all the way back to the very beginning of humanity, and is very detailed with how the human race will end, all the way down to the death of the last existing human. According to the description of this SCP, many of the entries in the text revolve around numerous of the SCPs in the Foundation, describing multiple events in which an SCP who was, or is currently under their occupation, ended humanity. However, the entries don't always revolve around the Foundation itself. Some are more conventional, quote-unquote, such as a nuclear apocalypse, alien invasion, and even a deadly pandemic. This book updates quite frequently, remaining relatively up to date with the present, up until a point of diversion where the apocalyptic event is predicted to take place. Once the book is updated, its size is thickened accordingly. The Foundation actually finds quite a bit of usage for this anomaly, with it being continuously checked for relevant information, which the Foundation would find preventable. SCP-297, the Destructive Vibrator. SCP-297 is a standard-looking dildo for the most part. However, there are several abnormalities which set it apart from other pleasure devices. The standard on and off switch is instead replaced by levels of usage, ranging from the off setting to the suicide setting. The powering device for this vibrator is a nuclear reactor powered by small levels of plutonium, a chemical element which is often used for the purpose of creating atomic bombs. The friendly sounding suicide setting apparently vibrates at a frequency of 200 megahertz. To all you ladies out there, if you would like to for some reason replicate this effect, you might as well slam your pussy under a hydraulic press. SCP-659, the Flock of Intelligent Birds. SCP-659 is a group of birds which resemble herons. This SCP has been found to be native to North America, and according to the document, There is only one confirmed flock of these birds. However, several alleged sightings in Europe are still under investigation. The way this SCP works is pretty simple. When left alone, these birds are able to display intelligence surpassing most bird species, being able to use tools and solve basic level problems. However, the true issue comes when these birds are in a flock. When grouped together, these birds gain the combined intelligence of every other bird within that group. With that being said, this results in the group being able to solve far more complex problems and even outsmart the people supervising their containment cell. The amount of birds in the group that are needed to surpass human level intelligence are to which, at that point, these birds pose a significant threat of containment breach if not isolated. There was an incident that happened in which this SCP happened to breach containment and combine into a flock. On a containment breach at site released a flock of specimens of SCP-659, resulting in the death of all on-site personnel, with the exception of individuals. Summarized, the flock prevented any attempt to leave by pecking holes in the tires of every vehicle on site, severing phone lines, and sending a detachment to observe the facility from the air. Many point to this incident as the reason why its classification was changed from Euclid to the more dangerous Keter classification. SCP-738, the Devil's Deal. This SCP consists of 3 separate items which encompass the entirety of SCP-738. SCP-738-1 consists of a desk labeled with the same name, surrounded by old-timey furniture. SCP-738-2 consists of a basic-looking chair seated in front of SCP-738-1. And SCP-738-3 is a throne-like chair with several brass embellishments accompanying it. This SCP works as a DLU form with an entity that resembles Satan. In order for it to work, you must sit in SCP-738-2. At this point, the throne will, unbeknownst to you, begin moving around without any form of logical manipulation. You will then hear a distorted voice attempt to strike a deal with you to achieve your wildest dreams, all for a price. According to several instances and experiences, these prices can be relatively bargained. However, the universal price involves some sort of physical and/or psychological pain. Once the deal is accepted, the price will have been instantly paid, and the request fulfilled. The Foundation has conducted several experiments revolving around the SCP, and the tests go as follows. Test 6 seems to be the most interesting, involving a researcher who asks a simple question of "What are you?" The results are as follows. Entity, taking the appearance of a large snake, states, "I'm sorry. It's against policy to divulge personal details, but may I interest you in..." Researcher stood from chair, shaking and ending the session. Researcher was then placed in Mental Institution 5, awaiting review due to information revealed by the offer. SCP-899, Phantom Children. This anomaly refers to a phenomenon which most commonly takes the form of children with a phantom-like appearance. These children are reported as being entirely featureless, often being hard to distinguish a specific physical feature or even their genders. The children reside in a secluded forest area, being in a group of an unspecified amount. If any person comes in the vicinity of this SCP, they will commence hostility such as harassing the individual, cursing at it, and throwing items like rocks at it in attempts to drive the individual away from the area. If an adult human is to come into direct physical contact with this SCP, they will undergo a complete memory wipe of their entire adult life, being left with only their prepubescent memories. This effect, for obvious reasons, poses a serious threat to personnel meant to handle this SCP, as it could result in serious decline of their intelligence capacity and knowledge of the Foundation. If any prepubescent children are to come into any physical contact with this SCP, the child will entirely disappear. Further tests are being conducted to explain what happens to the children who come into contact with the phenomenon, but the most common consensus is that either the victim is transported to an unknown location, or the more severe possibility that the victim just entirely ceases to exist. This prospect becomes much more plausible when you notice that after the children disappear, the phantom children begin to take some of the features of the lost child. This SCP was formerly safe, but eventually had its classification changed to Euclid after an incident involving Dr. SCP-925, the Mushroom Cultist. SCP-925 are a group of 13 specimens of entities who appear to closely resemble a human male. According to several tests done by the Foundation, this SCP appears to be intersex, and any instances of them reproducing has yet to be observed under containment and in the outside world. The specimens who encompass this SCP are designated for one clear task. Any prey of this SCP becomes so once the victim comes into any physical contact with this SCP. Touching the SCP will result in the victim becoming closely attached and sympathetic to the species. Prolonged physical contact with this SCP, Around 3 to 5 minutes will result in the victim practically worshipping this SCP. Once around 10 of these victims are under this trance-like state, one of the specimens of this SCP will take them to a secluded location with the purpose of digging an immensely large cavern. Any attempt to stop the victims will be met with violence. After reaching their destination, the people are worked to near death to plant mushrooms, avoiding the consumption of them to the point of severe malnutrition. Any victims who are worked to near death have their corpses used as fertilizer. Once the mushrooms are ready for harvest, the SCP will devour a large portion of the crops and will only return back once the majority of their workers die. A test was conducted by the Foundation to precisely examine the effects of the SCP on their victims. The tests involve interviewing their test subject pre- and post-exposure to see any behavioral changes. The initial interview, pre-exposure, had the test subject deliver a significantly negative reaction to SCP-925. However, once the subject was exposed to the SCP, a significant change in behavior and reaction proceeded with the interview. Quick exposure caused a sympathetic feeling in the subject. However, prolonged exposure left the subject blank in expression and very hostile to any insinuation that the SCP was negative.
Series 2
SCP-1004 Factory Porn. Factory porn is the name that coins SCP-1004. The SCP has two factors that encompass it. SCP-1004-1 is a CD labeled Factory Porn, and SCP-1004-2 is a floppy disk labeled the same thing. Both of these versions are the same in terms of how they function. When SCP-1004 is put into its proper device, you will see a program called the Factory.exe. When opened, the Factory logo is displayed, followed by the text, "What would you like to see?" Users are then allowed to search for any type of pornography of their choosing, and when I say anything, I mean anything. You're allowed to be as specific as you want, and the SCP will provide. For example, if you were to type something specific like Kim Kardashian gets finger blasted by Donald Trump while Chris Hansen hits her from the back, you will get that video in the exact way that you envisioned it. However, there is a very strange side effect that accompanies this SCP. The more you watch the porn provided by the SCP, the more depraved your search results become. The people who have allegedly used this SCP apparently went from the casual porn that most normal people would watch, to the depths of necrophilia, bestiality, pedophilia, and really any form of depravity they can think of. SCP-1535, the Jar of Sapience. SCP-1535 is a casual-looking mason jar that was made in the 1940s. From an outsider's perspective, it doesn't appear to have any anomalous properties present. And that's true, up until the point where a non-sapient entity enters the jar. Once inside, the entity receives incredibly high intelligence, fluency in the Spanish language, and the knowledge of Catholicism and Morse code. The only real downside to this SCP is the short lifespan it has, with it dying within 1 to 2 hours of being in the jar. SCP-1706, the Dream Eater DVD. SCP-1706 is a DVD revolving around an unaired pilot episode of a show, happily named Eater of Dreams. The episode revolves around 7 protagonist characters who are in the midst of a crisis within their city. The episode follows these characters, who constantly ask people such as officials and officers about these beings called Eaters, who are described as being cannibalistic. Several scenes in the background involve unrelated characters who are naked, interacting with other characters in the background, strangely receiving no acknowledgement. After the viewing of the episode, several severe alterations can be caused within people. The large majority report effects of sudden memory loss of certain things, a loss of understanding of things that were once common knowledge, and a strange replacement of knowledge from one skill to another. Further, more severe effects involve a rise of inappropriate behavior, to heavy mood swings, to a sudden appearance of symptoms similar to PTSD and schizophrenia. SCP-1843, the Goat Ritual. SCP-1843 is a strangely shaped structure, reported as being hollow inside. The Foundation believes it as being of extraterrestrial nature. However, its composition revolves around earthly elements. This SCP only affects Ovis, a mammal similar in appearance to that of a ram or specific goat species. If any species of Ovis are within a 2-kilometer radius of SCP-1843, they will attempt to make their way towards it. Once the Ovis are next to it, usually in a group of 5, a ritual will commence, referred to as SCP-1843-A. This ritual involves the brutal killing of one of the female Ovis in the group, with rare instances having some of its remains occasionally devoured by the other Ovis. Once the killing is done, its remains are placed within SCP-1843 by the oldest Ovis, using a door found in the SCP. After the ritual, the Ovis will bow their heads and leave the vicinity, presumably until their next ritual.
Series 3.
SCP-2000, Humanity's Last Hope. This is the first Thaumiel class SCP in this video, so I'll take the opportunity to give a brief description of what this classification entails. The Thaumiel class is a class used to label SCPs who have the capability of containing or counteracting other SCPs. In short, SCP-2000 is used as a last bastion to preserve human civilization. There are a lot of complex details that accompany this document for this SCP, including specific powering systems and intricate details of its functionality. What this SCP does specifically is attempt to counteract what the Foundation deems a K-class scenario. For those who don't know, a K-class scenario is an event in which humanity is under severe possibility of extinction. The way this SCP counteracts this is by creating new humans to repopulate the planet. Its production capacity stands at approximately 100,000 humans per day, with a 5-day cooldown. This SCP was created around years ago, and interestingly, it's been activated at least twice since its completion. SCP-2020. Cliché, right? SCP-2020 is a humanoid entity, appearing like the stereotypical alien. It has green skin and the classic huge black eyes. It's docile by nature and only attempts to converse with personnel around them, telling them about strange science fiction plots that it wishes to someday write about. But the interesting part comes when it was interviewed by researcher King. This interview somewhat served as SCP-2020 rambling about numerous science fiction plots like it normally would. But slowly, the plots became more specific to information regarding the Foundation. Its story started going to plots about specific SCPs which were under the Foundation's containment. Keep in mind that SCP-2020 had never interacted with these entities at any point in time. SCP-2020 also managed to extensively describe itself and its anomalous properties, all paired along with its containment. However, the interview became disturbing when SCP-2020 described a plot about a strange facility, which would be used after an end-of-the-world scenario to create new humans to repopulate Earth. If the bells aren't ringing yet, SCP-2020 extensively described the functionality of SCP-2000, the previous SCP I mentioned beforehand, which would serve as humanity's reset button. Once again, this SCP was able to perfectly describe this level of classified information, despite having no prior knowledge of any of its existence. The interview was stopped shortly after its rambling, and how SCP-2020 obtained this classified information is currently under investigation by the Foundation. SCP-2219. Porridge. SCP-2219 is an unlicensed video game for the trademark Game Boy. The game is titled Porridge, and it serves as a loose video game interpretation of the famous story Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The manual that accompanies this SCP goes as follows.
Immersive 5D game experience. Goldilocks is come to be roused. Danger much. You heard BR throne and pregnant BR princess and conquer BR people. Unwanted. It begins. The press starts to level. Prove you wrong. A word of caution. 5D feature doing much. Failure is test instant weak undeserving source after kind. Incompetence will be penalized. This is necessary. You agree? Good.
Several experiments and tests were carried out to see the effects that this SCP would have on humans. The results vary depending on your in-game performance. Collecting 100 porridge results in a sensation of contentment and relaxation. The collection of 500 porridge results in immediate orgasm. If you do not collect at least 25 porridge, you will undergo a light seizure. Losing a life in general results in throat inflammation. Losing all lives results in the contraction of leprosy. Losing a life to the boss Pa results in tooth decay. Losing a life to the boss Ma results in permanent blindness. And losing a life to the final boss Dagron results in immediate cardiac arrest. The effect caused for defeating the final boss and completing the game has yet to be seen, but the investigation is still underway. SCP-2219 is to be contained in a locker at Site-59, with direct human testing no longer being permitted. SCP-2399. The Red Dot. SCP-2399 is labeled by many as the Malfunctioning Destroyer, an entity who resides in the Red Dot on Jupiter. SCP-2399 apparently crash-landed on the gas planet after a hard collision with one of its moons, Io. SCP-2399 apparently had its destructive weapons pointed at Earth, but after its collision had its entire brunt force hit Jupiter instead of Earth, resulting in the creation of Jupiter's red dot. After the tumultuous damage that was inflicted, SCP-2399 has been attempting to reconstruct itself using drone-like structures that follow a command that was traced as far as the Triangulum Galaxy, which is several million light-years away from Earth. SCP-2399 reconstructs itself at a rate of less than 1% every year, 0.78% to be exact. If SCP-2399 reaches a reconstruction of around 75% completion, the imminent destruction of Earth will be inevitable. Ever since it was discovered, the Foundation has tried to intercept the commands in hopes to cease or at least slow down its completion. But so far, any attempts of doing so have proven futile and pretty much entirely pointless as of now. SCP-2798. This Dying World. SCP-2798 is another Thaumiel-class SCP, having been under operation by the Foundation since 1971, with the purpose of containing arguably one of the most unknown SCPs. SCP-001. Speculations of what SCP-001 is are all over the place, and almost resembles more of a thought concept given how mysterious it is. SCP-2798 works by causing Earth to seem as one single entity, which accordingly changes the intent of SCP-001 and its perception. However, the Foundation has noticed an increasing loss in functionality and strength in SCP-2798. And it's expected to lose all functionality in the very near future, putting humanity in serious danger of the effects of SCP-001. SCP-2852. Cousin Johnny. SCP-2852 resembles a middle-aged Caucasian man. From an outside perspective, SCP-2852 doesn't appear to have really any anomalous properties at all. However, close examination would prove that SCP-2852 does not have any internal organs. People who come into contact with SCP-2852 during an event commonly refer to it as Cousin Johnny and view him as a longtime member of their family without question. SCP-2852 commonly appears at baptisms, weddings, and funerals, many of which tend to be Catholic or generally religious in nature. These events which SCP-2852 attends are corresponded by a specific color, labeled blue, white, and black level events. Blue level events more often revolve around a kid's baptism, in which SCP-2852 will take first-hand involvement with the baptism and submerge the child. At this point, the child's skin will notably come off in chunks, but surprisingly causes no initial pain within the child. Once the baptism has been completed and the child's skin has come off, the godparents that are there for its baptism will proceed to eat the skin between themselves. If SCP-2852 appears at a wedding, it will present itself as a groomsman, and the effects of it will proceed after the vows have been given. Bridesmaids and groomsmen will gain the sudden compulsion to rip out their teeth and hand them to the couple. This couple will then proceed to eat the teeth, resulting in significant damage to their own. Upon completion, the groom will then sing a song, resulting in a volume equivalent to that of a jet engine taking off right next to you, the volume of which is obviously painful and in most cases deafening. During a funeral, SCP-2852 will deliver a speech, normally being of incoherent nature. The closest person to the casket will then proceed to pull out a knife of unknown origin, and will then walk up to open the casket. Once opened, the person will then proceed to slit its own wrists and pour a deadly amount of their own blood within it. All other people attending the funeral will follow suit, and children who are too young will have their wrists slit by their parents or close family members, and still have their blood poured in. Once everyone has done so, SCP-2852 will then walk up to the casket and vomit a mixture of strange rubble and blood until the casket is practically filled. Any and all events caused by SCP-2852 are to be closely monitored by personnel, with all people involved being treated to an amnestic.
Series 4.
SCP-3239. Death's Phone Call. SCP-3239 is a black bakelite telephone, which activates between the hours of on the last Tuesday of every month. SCP-3239 works mainly for the purpose of a phone call. However, people who pick up the phone state no compulsion to do so. Once answered, an older woman with a Swedish accent will pick up the phone, referred to as SCP-3239-1. She will then ask for a name. On most occasions, if the person provides a name, or none at all, the call will be ended. However, on rare occasions, people who fail to provide a name will cause the call to continue, and SCP-3239-1 will start to become agitated with the caller not providing a name. Once the caller states a name at that point, the instance of SCP-3239-1 will cease to exist and will then be replaced by the voice of the name you stated. referred to as SCP-3239-2. SCP-3239-2 will be heard on the call, but reportedly does not acknowledge the caller on the other end. However, some cases prove otherwise. At this point in the phone call, audio of the call will insinuate the death of SCP-3239-2 through circumstantial audio. People who have used the phone report feelings of depression and a doctor's diagnosis of several mental illnesses, causing a severe change in behavior within the subject. SCP-3239 is to be contained in a soundproof locker, so as to not cause awareness of the phone call, only to be opened and used for testing purposes. SCP-3503 Anarcho-PTSD. SCP-3503 is a contagious form of PTSD, which is often manifested and fully achieved by a matter of 3 notable stages. Stage 1 lasts for around half a decade, normally having very similar symptoms to regular PTSD, rendering it pretty much indistinguishable between the two. The only real abnormality that separates SCP-3503 from regular PTSD is a common appearance of satyrs during dreams, with many people who have contracted SCP-3503 reporting around 40% of their dreams involving satyrs in some way or another. However, these satyrs are not the main focus of these dreams. Stage 2 is where the abnormalities become much more evident. People in Stage 2 start to develop this sudden appreciation for SCP-3503 and become more grateful for the effects of their PTSD. However, when questioned, subjects are unable to pinpoint a specific reason. Dreams of satyrs begin to increase tremendously, with them slowly starting to become the main focus of their dreams. The relevance and significance of satyrs in these dreams are still under investigation. Stage 3 is where shit really hits the fan. People who are in Stage 3 not only see their PTSD very positively, but even begin to see a positive outcome in spreading SCP-3503. Stage 3 patients become much more prone to violence and anarchist ideals, often being prompted to want to commit extreme acts of violence such as mass bombings, shootings, and actions similar in nature. SCP-3503 is not spread by conventional means like sneezing or coughing. Instead, it is spread through psychological means. Any person within a 50 to 60 meter radius will become more prone to contracting SCP-3503. However, real contagious nature begins if people experience a traumatic event within that radius. It can also be contracted through people who already have PTSD, being within the radius of SCP-3503. Containment of SCP-3503 has proven to be extremely difficult, and is more so monitored using the news to report criminals and anarchist events to trace SCP-3503 and contain it. SCP-3883 Dildos Have Dreams. SCP-3883 takes the appearance of a tentacle-like dildo, measuring somewhere around 7 inches. On its own, it doesn't necessarily have any anomalous properties. However, this is changed when SCP-3883 is placed either facing a reflective object or 1.5 meters away from a person. If SCP-3883 is placed next to a reflective object, it could take on several strange appearances through its reflection. For some strange reason, it doesn't tend to work when reflected with a mirror. However, if reflected through a liquid, the image will show an octopus-like appearance. If SCP-3883 is placed next to a sleeping individual undergoing REM sleep, the person will experience a very strange dream. This dream involves the individual being chased by a 10-foot entity with tentacle appendages, presumably being some sort of manifestation of SCP-3883. The only way to escape this dream is to be either woken up by someone else or to die within your dream. SCP-3908 Inception. This SCP is by far one of the most mysterious SCPs known to the Foundation. Any and all information about SCP-3908 is classified, presumably by high-ranking officials. Containment of this SCP is very simple. It's kept in its own containment unit, with the only instructions being to not write about or speak of SCP-3908. The reason given by the Foundation for this being the case is apparently to prevent SCP-3908 from becoming SCP-3908. A little confusing. Any form of description of this SCP is kept extremely vague. In fact, too vague. There was an interview held with SCP-3908, and the interview goes as follows. The person begins the interview by asking SCP-3908 what its name is, to which it responds with SCP-3908. The person then asks what its real name is, to which SCP-3908 gives the same response. Over time throughout the interview, SCP-3908 becomes more agitated and distressed with the fact that its knowledge of what it is restricted to its Foundation-given designation. The first interview ends with SCP-3908 injuring the interviewer and having the discussion ceased. The second and third interviews commence several days after, with the same interviewer asking for SCP-3908 to refrain from referring to itself as SCP-3908. This effect garners actual results, with SCP-3908 revealing itself to be Craig Watson, a 40-year-old man with anger issues, born in the year 1978 in Redmond, Washington. SCP-3999. Everything wrong with the world. SCP-3999 is the first Apollyon class in this video, capable of causing the end of reality.
Do not look at SCP-3999. It cannot harm you if you do not look at it. Do not look direct at it. Do not form a mental picture in your head of SCP-3999. If you do receive a visual image of it, you will die. If you even try to comprehend it, you will die. Do not look at SCP-3999. SCP-3999 is you reading this. SCP-3999 is former Vice President of the United States Mike Pence. SCP-3999 is food. SCP-3999 is several moldy blankets. SCP-3999 is researcher Talorant's soul. SCP-3999 is a murderous penguin. SCP-3999 is not quadrilateral. SCP-3999 is the last moment of the sun. SCP-3999 is the administrator of the SCP Foundation. SCP-3999 is all of the above. At once. Forever. At all times. In your dreams. This can be the only conclusive fact. So stop asking. I hate myself. I love myself. Siri. These Siri are for online accounts. Access and explanation is unavailable. Receive this information through your own volition. This is not a test. Disclosure of further classified information will result in termination. Treat all information as no ID in your life. Do not release beyond this point. Failure to comply will result in termination.